Everybody, and welcome on the opening weekend of the newly reopened Australian collection at the Queensland Art Gallery. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered and pay my respects to elders past, present and those emerging. My name is Fiona Neal and I'm the Acting Head of Public Engagement here at QAGOMA. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion, Zombie Art History, in which we'll seek to explore alternative approaches to displaying and conceptualising Australian art, drawing upon your Australian collection reimagined, and using the hang as a focal point for thinking about broader questions of chronology and museology. Our host is Dr. Amelia Barikin, lecturer in art history, School of Communication and Arts at the University of Queensland, and she is joined by Michael Aird, research fellow, School of Social Science at the University of Queensland, Dr. Rex Butler, professor of art history and theory at Monash University in Melbourne, and our own Dr. Kyla McFarlane, curatorial manager of Australian art at QAGOMA. There will be an opportunity, we hope, for questions at the end, pending time, but in the meantime, please join me in making our panel feel very welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. Can I just get a sense first, before we begin, of how many people have actually been through the gallery today? Oh, that's excellent, because we don't necessarily have many images to refer to, so when we talk about works, it's great that some of you at least have them in your mind. Before we get into the content, I should say a little bit about why we four are here talking about this topic, which may or may not be a familiar one to you. Zombie art history was a term that I invented to think about why or how the past figures in the present. So I was thinking in particular about undead images, or this idea that the historian or the curator or the museologist or the writer has a potential to reanimate elements of the past in the way that they are configured, either spatially or in textual forms. So all four of us have very different investments in the way that history, in particular, is portrayed, and the role of chronology, I think, in the way that that history is portrayed. So Kyla McFarlane has a background in photography, photographic theory, and feminist historiographies of Australian art. Michael Aird's been working as a photographer and a research associate, doing fantastic work with photographs of Aboriginal people particularly from Queensland, and also taking his own photographs. And of course Rex, you would all know, many of you, who we miss very much and is now down at Monash but used to be up here at UQ, has done extensive work on thinking through what Australian art history might mean both from this place and from outside a perspective. So things like un-Australian art history and revisionist art history. These are also questions that deal with chronology. So of course one of the key and extremely noticeable aspects of the current hang that we have of the Australian art galleries is that it has disrupted what used to be a fairly staid path through various different periods of time. And perhaps, Kyla, before I get you to talk about, what needed to be changed with that, Rex, could you remind us what used to be there?
Yeah, well, I have been in Queensland for a long time. I taught at UQ for over 20 years. It means I visited the gallery regularly over 20 years, and I think over that time there were two things that happened. Certainly, let's say the first 10 years, you're quite right, the hang was largely chronological, and what that was the classic story of Australia receiving overseas art movements and nationalising them 10 years after they happened in Paris. So you'd have the Australian realists, the Australian impressionists, the Australian Cubists, the Australian modernists, the Australian surrealists, and that narrative would go right up to the present, where you'd have Australian feminists, say, of the 70s, as opposed, so that was the story, and it was a chronological hang. Then about 10 years ago, I think maybe under Julie Ewington, you had rooms that were thematic hangs, and you started to get contestations of that classic Australianist art history, so that, for example, there was a room, and this is one of its particular things, of the Australian expatriates. So you had the bunnies and so on hung in a room together. The other thing she did, again, responding to recent historiographical trends, is she began, and we'll talk about this because this is again one of the things that Kyla's responded to in this hang. You can enter the gallery from two ways, from the left and the right, you can say it, the long hang. And at the beginning of the left hang, there was some William Baracks, a black artist, I'll put in Aboriginal artist. So it was a sort of rewriting of the whole of what would come after from an Aboriginal perspective. And at the other end of the gallery, as a sort of pun, quite witty but maybe contestable, there was a Peter Booth black painting at the other end of this kind of hang. Because then, of course, at that point,
Maybe not so good.
You'd go across to GOMA and start the story from the 70s onwards. So the Peter Booth was the end of that moment. And, of course, the intention was you had these two moments from both ends. Curators play puns on things like colour and so on. Fair enough, I think that's allowable. But so therefore the hang started to be much more thematisable. There was a wall of women artists, which in some ways still persists in this hang too, with the early painters and that first collected works. So there were those sorts of arguments being made. It was still broadly chronological, but it was inputting certain rereadings of that classic history, because there was a sort of tension between narrating it recognisably and contesting the recognisable narration. And there'll be elements of that, I think, in this hang that we can start to talk about too. Yeah.
And so what has actually changed in the way that this new hang is approaching chronology particularly?
Well, in terms of chronology, that's a really interesting point, because we talked about it a lot and we to and froed around that question and thought about the fact that you could completely disavow it. You could actually just get rid of it entirely and just go fully thematic. And I think Michael Hawker and I went to see, for example, the NGA hang when that was redone recently, and that was kind of an instance of that. And so we talked a lot about that and kind of came to the conclusion that we didn't want to release it completely. We kind of have a buck both ways in this hang, which I think is nice because it gives you a bit of an anchoring from which more thematic narratives emerge and kind of correspond to. And the space was a really important part of configuring what we did, because we worked closely with Chris Sains, the director, who was at the same time opening up the space from the rooms that you would have seen in, Julie's hang, the 4 separate rooms, and then into Gallery 14. So we had this massive space to contend with, and how do we work within that? So at that time of thinking around chronology, we were also thinking about the space. So we came up with this idea of that back wall that edges onto the Whale Mall is like a concession to chronology, and it's a national narrative of Australian landscape from colonial to contemporary. But it's loose too. Like if you go down,
well, it begins with Gordon Bennett.
Exactly. So we disrupt it right
kind
from
of
the
way,
start.
Right,
yeah. So nothing's always as it seems in that space. Yeah. And even Dale Harding. Well, Dale Harding is really about chronology because that's talking about the thousands of years of Aboriginal art present in galleries and rock art galleries around Western Queensland. So that was our big chronological spine, and it was a national story. And then we looked at thematics that kind of tipped out of that and related to that. And they have their own little chronologies within them, but they're not, conventionally chronological. So, yeah.
One of the things I like about the hang is that instead of presenting us with a history of art as something that might be a stylistic progression, which is that, that narrative that you were outlining before, it almost presents us with a range of artworks that look onto history. So it's almost the opposite. And I think this is something that you have also done in your treatment of particularly kind of the curatorial work that you've been working with, but also your practice with photographic archives, this idea that the work or the image is something that allows us to look onto history rather than is part of a progressive stylistic narrative. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you've approached that.
Well, I think the first thing is I always sum up myself as a history and museum person far more than an art person, and yet I love sort of comparing the two and using sort of art methodologies to display history. And I think from every exhibition I curate, one of the main things I try and aim for is that sort of that initial walk in and wow factor, and that's what I think you get particularly with the long passageways either side. you really appreciate what a big, grand space you're in.
It's huge.
And also looking up at the freestanding, ceiling that Robin Gibson, designed, same as the Queensland Museum on level 2 has the exact same huge ceiling, and yet the Queensland Museum's temporary walls which are not structural, haven't been shifted since the building opened in 1986. So, it is important to see
really
the space look different and have that wow. So there's sort of, I guess, from that one history point, thinking about all, as Rex said, all the things that have gone on in this room. It's an important space. And then, of course, to me, there's all this history on the walls that just happens to be art as well, So it really crosses. So I see a lot of crossovers.
But what about the idea, if we were going to visualise the way in which that history was presented, one of the kind of the classic visualisations of historical progression is something like a river or a train, or the whole narrative about Australian art history being, are we getting on the carriage too late? Have we arrived early? Which stop are we getting off at? Where are we going? Are we even on the right train? But there's this other way of thinking about it when you have the spine and the narrative of the landscape tradition where you can walk in and out of those particular kinds of configurations. And I think, for those of you who haven't seen it, Michael has a show that's on at the moment at the UQ Anthropology Museum, which is excellent, and I highly recommend it, called From Relics to Rights. It's the history of Aboriginal people and anthropology at the University of Queensland. And he's taken an historical narrative, something like From Relics to Rights, but has opened it up spatially, so you can move around those objects and you're not forced to progress along the conveyor belt model of history, we might say, which is something that I was thinking about with undead images as well, like the idea that those things from the past are not left in the past, but are reclaimed in the present or reanimated in the present. There was this, I remember this classic review, it was Gombrich reviewing Hauser, and he was criticising the idea that you could possibly look at the past through a kaleidoscope instead of a telescope. But I feel like what we've got here is a kaleidoscope effect. And was that a deliberate manifestation, or were you thinking...
That's a really nice analogy, actually, because we've been noticing, and you don't notice things until the space is open too, that there's like networks going through and across and around the space. And I like that. Your idea of zombie art history and things being, undead in the present is really interesting to me in that respect, because it is this kind of living, not living presence. You've got, I like to think about that central part in the hang, which has very precious and, emotionally effective works like people like Vidalet, Godfrey Rivers, Under the Jacaranda, the first Australian work that's came into the collection as this kind of heart space, but then things do kaleidoscope out and around that. Helen Johnson's commissions, look directly back at two paintings in that hang, but then you cross out into, a narrative around Macpherson contact with, Australian Aboriginal people, the north of Australia for hundreds of years, that predates that and spirals back into fair weather. So there are these, maybe not kaleidoscopic, but kind of cross-current things happening across the hang.
What do you think, do we lose anything though by going in that direction? Because there is still, I have to use this as a teaching space for my students, exactly. And there is a bunch of investments that we have about thinking of historical context and the particular moments that things arise. So I don't want to be entirely, on the kaleidoscope side or the undead side of viewing of history, because I do think, things obviously do die. It's not as though everything is always alive. But if we think about contemporary, the word being contempo, like with time and with the time that we are in now, then there's a responsibility that we have towards those objects as well to be able to keep them circulating and moving. But what do you think? Do we lose anything, Rex, by doing... the criticism could be that now we have, it's an ahistorical hang almost.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've written things about the gallery hangs over the years. Post one of the APTs, and of course the APT is an incredible curatorial challenge, which I think has affected many of the ways that this place thinks about everything. In fact, Li Yufang is an incredible hang to put in the Australian collection. I mean, totally interesting.
I'm glad you like that.
Yeah,
'cause
that's a
we've
nice
had-
question.
It's something
Yeah,
that people comment
controversial
on,
and
but
interesting.
yeah.
But, you know, the sort of, if I put it this way, the sort of unclassifiability from a Western perspective of like a global art show like that led to many hangs being sort of iconomorphic, like you match the look of things. And I remember writing something in the Courier Mail, post one of those shows, you had this room that was all grey objects. They just simply had nothing in common, but they all happened to be grey. And I thought that was nuts, you know.
It looked good though.
Yeah, because you know it wasn't actually, their works weren't about their colour, they just happened to be grey, right?
Yeah.
It looked like sort of interior decor, like someone, an expensive person with a lot of money could build their house. And you know, a lot of this show works by those kind of visual connections or rhymes. And of course that is a very important part of curating because it does break it out of history and sort of determinism of history and makes the works, as you say, cross their own histories and to speak in ways that would be unexpected and didn't happen in reality, but they speak to each other very interestingly. But it is a great challenge because you can sort of overplay that, I think, and imply things. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's not being critical, but beautifully in the sightlines you have the Hermannsburg show at the top. And of course, that's a very lovely point that the William Dargie portrait and his son's version of it and Hermannsburg tradition still lives into the present. And then you have the Thai artists, which sort of are connected and have that same, quote, roughness, etc. Now, you could sort of say, what is one doing by hanging them visually in a relationship? Is one truly making a connection, or is that just suggestive? Now, that's not being critical. It's just the very complex problems that start to... Because when you collapse historical placement and a sort of stylistic progression, the really challenging question is on what logic do you actually put anything together anymore apart from visually attractive connections, right? And because you've got lovely things with plays of Yellow with the Delafield Cook and the Rosie Gascoigne, the Gaboris and stuff, and you sort of go...
and then it gets into pseudomorphism territory.
And I mean,
Madonna Staunton and Grace Crowley.
That's right. You know, that's really interesting. I mean, but I would be very interested to hear how you thought about that.
Well, I think it's a mix of things, and I mentioned the idea of beauty, I think, and the aesthetics of particularly that space where it is looking at non-figurative works. There's a lot of aesthetic connections there, more formal connections, but they're within a plurality. So I think that in a way we were doing both those things. Like there are some really beautiful aesthetic connections and moments, but conceptually there is a richness to that. Like I think in the that non-figurative space, you've got this kind of thread of calligraphic forms going through and influences. Someone like Howard Arkley, the early Howard Arkley has a very strong, influence there. And then you move across to someone like Irene Chu and then John Peart, and that, well, and obviously the Leo Fan, there's those connections carrying through, but they're also very pleasing.
in a very aesthetically pleasing. But
and also there is an emphasis on different approaches in that space, but connected through, I think, quite pure formal connections in a way. So I
mean, obviously that'd be an incredibly interesting show. The influence of Asian art on a moment. It's like Peter Rappel. You have a couple of those. That would have been something you would have considered putting in the exhibition, I presume, to make that a much more historical connection, right? Yeah.
And is it something that you think about as a curator as well, Michael? I mean, all of your work is about telling stories in a way. Like, how do you approach that storytelling process from a time perspective?
And I'm more generally, I work in chronology as well.
Yeah.
But I think with this hang, I mean, again, it's the use of the space. You don't feel like you're pigeonholed from one space to the next. There's the whole, I guess, the disjointed. I wouldn't say disjointed, but the way...
Could be.
The story, it works. That's the main thing. And I just continually am surprised, by we're finding artists and not expecting to find them. And I think Chris was saying the other day, you've got 30% of the show is Indigenous artists. So that's and it's just brilliant to have that volume worked in and not ghettoised in any way at all.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And there's a strong Queensland thread too. I mean, you walk in through the Robinson over your head, which is nicely done, the Fairweathers, even the Bribie Islands by Nolan, which is a clever touch. Then you have the Gordons. And as Michael and I were saying, you have the Fristums, who are a foundational Queensland painter, comes from Sweden, which is a great immigrant story, but you have him in dialogue with Vernon, another Queenslander. And that's much more intelligent than just having, say, another Aboriginal from somewhere else. It's a Queensland story in that connection as well as something else, a white-black one. It's very intelligently done, I think.
Famous for his portraiture.
Yes, indeed. And that would be an incredibly interesting show, of course. The long history of artists painting Aborigines is an incredibly great show. There's a suggestion.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Totally great idea for a show, I think.
I think you pointed out two really purposeful things, which were the inclusion of the Indigenous Australian collection and also the contemporary Australian collection, which hasn't happened before in those spaces. But also to, bring that to the fore, the Indigenous works, in a really, positive way that actually did also complicate existing histories that were being told in the collection. I mean, those works have all, been there. It's just about bringing them out to kind of, build that richness. And it's interesting that you're mentioning the Namatjira space because Namatjira's story is really the start of the hang, and then you do go through down into Dale's beautiful work. And there was a purposeful bookending of Dale with ending up with, one of the key narratives in Australian art, not just Indigenous art, the Central and Western Desert, ending with the beautiful Utopia panels with Emily's work. So if you, no matter how you enter that space, either side, you actually get this Indigenous presence, which was very, that was very conscious. And, we had discussions around the fact that, like people like someone like Lambert is not in the hang. We've got beautiful works.
Yeah.
I mean,
we could start doing the what's not in the hang conversation.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
We just keep going,
You do.
You have limited wall space.
Things come out that would have been in that space for, a long time, but I think it's good to own what you've done at this point in time, and then someone else can come and, reconfigure it in 3 years' time.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess in terms of curatorial and museological history, this idea of, revising a chronological hang is not entirely new. It's been happening since the 90s. We have a huge body of discourse and literature around new museology and revisionist or anachronistic strategies of curating, but mostly, those kinds of insertions of older works or contemporary works into older galleries have not been about a whole-scale revisualisation of what history might look like. And I think that this is an interesting test case, in a way, for thinking about what it might do to history if we kind of explode it in that way, to be able to enter it from multiple points. I mean, this is what we really gain by getting off the train, leaving the highway. You have room for much more feminist dialogue, for different kinds of connections that might not have been there otherwise, and to think about who, if we want to think again about undead images or reanimations, those insertions of things that may have been forgotten, lost, left by the wayside are then given more space to breathe, I think. And it also happens within individual works. And that's another thing I like about it, is this idea that concept as a whole is actually echoed in the works in the show, like Richard Bell's Judgment Day, for example, does that in a way. Or does it, Rex? You would know.
No. Well, here's an interesting question. Obviously, one of the challenges that every contemporary gallery faces, if they are going to include Aboriginal art in the history of, quote, Australian art, do you still have the category of Australian art, right? And obviously Richard's, that judgment hangs over this entire exhibition. Is the category of what we're looking at any more Australian art? Or is it art from places like Queensland? I mean, a very complex question. Can one meaningfully, and lots of historians have tried to write histories of Australian art that do this, quite sympathetically, of course, mostly have failed, I think, to put together, Aboriginal and white art here and call it still Australian art. And it hasn't tended to work. That would no longer be the category, I think, that they'd sit under. No one's come up with an alternative. But that's the paradox of your hang, because in a way that question can only be asked from the point of view of Australia. We're the only people interested in that problem, actually, Australians. And we all know what Australians mean. But is there such a thing as Australian art? It's a very interesting question. If you include Indigenous art, because in many ways it's very hard to put them together, I think. You know, you can make puns, you can do clever things, but very interesting question. I mean, and I think...
Well, yeah, you start breaking it down. You say, you know, we've got Butler art, or, you know, we've got...
Yes, particular places. You know.
Wurundjeri art, or, you know, we've got all we've got many different nations within this one configuration.
Because Richard's other aphorism is Aboriginal art is a white thing, which means there is no such thing as Aboriginal art as a category, except from our point of view. There are places that make art. So that's another... So Aboriginal art is itself an Australian category, you know. So they're very interesting new questions. I mean, you grapple with them probably as well as you can do it. I don't think there's a solution, and yet you're expected to solve it as a curator and to present it.
Well, it really helps having access to all of the collections. I think it speaks to the kind of that institutional divide between, you know, there was an Australian collection, there was an Indigenous collection, there was a contemporary collection, and in the way that the space is configured, all the different barriers between the categorisations and typologies of work are broken down.
And that's good for sure.
And I think that's definitely a massive positive in terms of how we think about history as a constellation rather than, you know, a freeway.
I think the positioning of Richard's work in that space is really interesting. I mean, it's great that he is adjacent to the Central and Western Desert story. I mean, that's quite a tense relationship in lots of ways to have that work there. But that I feel like that work still has its own dignity and, you know, resonance there. Like, that's a really important history, and it's dignified in the way that we've presented it. But then he's right next to, there's Ian Byrne there, but there's also the Robert Macpherson work, which is a serial repetition of the shape of the state of Queensland, which is saying, you know, the local histories. I mean, those two works kind of undo everything we've done till we get to that spot, because we're River Bay, we're Moreton Bay, you know, like we're Fraser Island, we're really into these Queensland histories because we know those are the histories that we really want to tell from this place. You know, those are the ones that we can tell very well with the collection that we've got. But then Robert and Richard kind of undo that and you know, Robert's cookie cutter kind of serial repetition classification of the formation of the state and what even is that within the national context.
It turns it into an abstraction, right?
Exactly,
art. Like it says this category is an abstraction,
And then Richard doesn't place himself geographically.
No, exactly.
He's essentially, you know, I guess...
Contemporary,
urban, Indigenous, but urban could be from anywhere in Australia, isn't it?
Exactly, So that sort of endpoint provocation is an interesting point to kind of leave the space, but also enter the space if you come in from that end too. And Kathy Temin, actually, her minimalist work, which is, you know, fake fur, kind of manky, feminist rebuttal to someone who, you know, beautiful Robert Hunter, minimalist, you know, painter who, you know, I've got a lot of respect for, but, you know, she kind of unpicks all that and from a feminist point of view as well. So, there's conflicts and as well as harmonies in the hang, I think.
I don't really know what else to say with that. I was thinking about the relationship between the Vida Lay and the Helen Johnson, because I think that might be, but I know that you're doing a whole talk with Helen Johnson at 3 p.m, so perhaps you don't want to talk about that too much, but maybe a little bit.
I could mention it a little in the sense that, I mean, I think, so Helen came in, we've commissioned her and she looked across the collection and thought about which works she was going to respond to and picked 2 paintings of women at work, actually, interior spaces. So one's doing the washing, the other one, Amy Bale, they're having a break in the studio. So it's a, you know, portrait of an artist and her studio assistants. And she, you know, she's not disrespectful to those paintings, but she does think about what's happening outside the world of those interior spaces. So she looks at harsh political realities, for example, looks at the workers' strike that happened the same year that Vida painted her work, and the Federation and the Boer War, which was around the time of Amy Bale's work. So it's kind of, you know, nudging towards, you know, what is the context? I mean, it's interesting to think works are in frames, you know, and what is outside that frame. So that's what I think is interesting about that juxtaposition. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's constantly breaking those frames by bringing other material inside, and also
Yeah.
there's always something about gravity in her works, the way that the actual surface is so weighty. And there's
And
this
layered, and
like,
you almost can't
thickness,
see. Yeah.
which reminds me of the way that Bennett described, you know, the patternings and the sort of Pollock-esque treatment of dashes and dots over particularly his works of Possession Island, as interferences. And that might be another way of conceptualising what is happening to history in this non-chronological space, where you get different kinds of interferences or temporal interferences cross-pollinate. We have questions. We have time for some questions. Is there a question?
If you do have a...
Microphone.
It's such a jam-packed afternoon. I know we've got
It's huge, isn't it?
after this there's Diane Moon, and then Kyla's doing a talk, and then we just came from a talk, so I'm being kept to schedule.
Actually, just on that note, while you're doing the mic, that idea of interference, the Daniel Boyd Commission is a really interesting moment for that, because, you know, he talks about the devastating history of blackbirding, you know, basically slave labour and the state, and it's through that, you know, really devastating veil that he creates on the surface of his canvases. So I like that analogy.
I was just wondering, was there contestation or discussions, debates between the different curators as to who should be in, which work should be in, all of that sort of stuff?
How can there not be?
Yes. That's a really good question, and it's one, like, I'm pleased you ask it too, because you know, I'm a short-term Queenslander and about to leave Queensland as well now, but you know, there's curators in that department have a very deep knowledge of different areas, you know, and I was very respectful towards that in the sense that I learnt a lot from them in doing the you know, the process, and it really was an all-in thing where people brought things to the table, and we did workshops where we got together this massive amount of narratives, way too many narratives from all across the collection, and that was actually one of the really exciting things, where those narratives had input, and you actually see it in the space. You'll see that where, you know, different input has come from different parts of the expertise across the department. So it was really very much a team effort where you can see those threads crisscrossing through, even just in approaches to the space as well. There was a lot of discussion around that, everybody around the model from, you know, across the department. So I actually think that's a great thing about the hang, that there's all these different voices threading through together, and that's made it really rich as well. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to ask, was the opening up of the gallery, the way you described it, was that anything to do with the heritage listing, or was it purely curatorial?
No, it's actually, Chris, do you mind asking? Because this is, Chris's vision.
No, it long preceded even the plan or the request for the building to be classified. That occurred pretty much following a master plan that was developed for the cultural precinct by the last government, which included a couple of very big towers. And the point of the towers was in some way to kind of then help the government pay for the balance of works, etc., etc. It's a long story, but that's all gone, and it's not coming back. And that got the Architects Association pretty fired up about the preservation of the Gibson building as seen from the city and its relationship to the range behind it. Of course, it's now obscured by multiple apartments behind it, that's by the by. But all of the thinking about getting the building open started in 2013. It didn't have anything to do, we didn't even know the building would be heritage listed at the time. And we've got a lot further to go with it as well.
How long is this iteration of the rehang going to last?
That's a Chris question too.
About
Good to
4
know,
years,
Diane.
because we have a requirement
Glad
to
you're
do the
here.
floors again in 4 years' time.
Oh, 4 years. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a bit ridiculous that I should know that. But obviously, you know, paintings will come and go on loan, other things will go up, works on paper will change. We are going to move it around quite a bit, I think. But the bones of it, probably 3 to 4.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's
Chris. It's very handy that you're in the room, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah. Good luck.
I have some suggestions for shows you could do. I hope you don't mind. I mean, because I think this is a very suggestive show which raises lots of questions.
Yeah.
But as we might think, you know, what pressures do scholarship put on such exhibitions? Like what knowledge is produced by throwing up questions curatorially? And I think some of the things that this show implies, which could make magnificent exhibitions, and they haven't been done, and you know, take them. One, I think there should be a really serious exhibition, like historical exhibition of Australian women artists. I think that's an absolute no-brainer.
Look, I've been wanting to do that for about
but everyone,
40 years.
But I just think, I mean,
It's on the wish
really a
list.
proper one would be a magnificent thing.
No, I don't think you invented that.
No, I didn't.
No.
Of course not. I'm not taking credit for that. I'm just putting it out there. This is one that's happened in
Good to
Britain,
hear a
but there's
man
one,
say it,
there's
though.
one
It's
called, there's an exhibition called Queer Britain on at the moment.
Yes,
Now, I think there
that's-
should be an exhibition of gay and lesbian artists in Australia. I think that'd
I
also,
agree.
I mean, there'd be a lot of crossover, but an incredibly interesting exhibition. Also be very popular. There should be one of expatriates. And I think the other exhibition, and this is complex, you know, I've always thought whether it'd be probably this is a bit late for this, but a sort of black-white show would be, I mean, that's been discussed historically, but say 8 examples of Indigenous white artists who've worked in each other's cultures and do them very seriously. Where you begin a very interesting question, where you'd end. You know,
Are you auditioning for Kyla's job?
No. You know, I had this idea.
We have a couple.
No. Anyway, all right. But I think they're great ideas, and they sort of come off this exhibition. Actually, right?
Well, the inclusion of Tim Johnson in the
Yes.
Western
Right.
Desert narrative is a
balance.
really,
Does some of that space.
I mean, I think Bruce was really interesting, our curator of Indigenous art, Bruce Johnson McLean, when he did the early Papania wall. Very interesting that he positioned him right at the centre of that, and that was really, I thought, was great. Yeah.
And one more thing is suggested by the show. Sorry, but if you put together Fristrom and say the Ray Cook. White artists trying to paint Aboriginal people would be another fascinating exhibition because it would tell us a lot about black-white relations and how that's changed and how for a period no one could do it, except sort of slightly kitschly, like Ray Cook, no offence, because you put the Tracy next to it. But now maybe people like Rod Moss are doing it again. And that's a fascinating question, why for a moment it artistically wasn't possible at the highest levels of accomplishment, I think, to paint
Well,
Aboriginal
Tom
people who are
Roberts
white.
too,
It's a really,
yeah.
but the long history of people trying to do it, realising they couldn't, or it becoming impossible in Australian visual culture, round about the time of Noel in the 50s, I think. And then you had to wait a long time until Indigenous people could represent themselves. Fascinating question, it seems to me.
I agree.
Make a
And
great
we have
show.
maybe more fascinating
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess the provocation though, all that's fantastic, Rex, but I think, while you've got that show here for 4 years, I guess I wanted to ask, and I'm sure that the intention is, what is it, all these ideas that it triggers, but I guess your intentions for ongoing public programs, ongoing educational resources, but also that the potential for, I guess, new scholarship or new directions or, new writing around those connections. Because while that's up for 4 years, that, as a curator is kind of constantly making short-term exhibitions, 4 years is a wonderful period of time to really get a broader assessment of what's going on there. So just a bit of a thought, or just a question about what your ongoing sense of publications, public programs, writing, so on, that you hope the show triggers.
It's great. Actually, that's the second time that question's come up today, which is really great. And I mean, it's one of my
there's a hunger for it. It's good.
It's
I love the
really
hunger.
good.
Feed the hunger.
And we haven't
Make the
published, a hard copy publication around this show, and I feel like, something, it gets up and you actually, now you understand what you've done and you actually really want to, talk about that. And I think hopefully that's an ongoing thing. But we're also talking today between us as curators in Australian art about how, each of those kind of bays of conversation and that hang have their own, really complex narratives. Like you get into that land and labour space and you just don't even know where to start because it's this huge kind of retelling of a really specific history, but it's also very kaleidoscopic and shattered. So, I mean, I would just love to see, a lot of writing, even in just response to the show, and new scholarship around it.
I'm so excited to be able to take my students. It's just so great to have the art back. Like having to do it for the last 2 years, we go and look at the one wall. It's been very sad.
I think it's
it's
a lot on it, but
it's not the same. Yeah.
I think it's a great starting point to look at not only the history of these works and where they've been exhibited and how they've been used in the past,
it's
through
a really good point.
to the space of the gallery as an institution and the history of it, and how has it changed focus and ways of curating over time, and particularly back to the early, before it was officially the Queensland Art Gallery, when it was in various locations in the city and didn't have a proper home. So looking back at that history. So there's a history
of the gallery to be had there, isn't there?
Well, there's both. They're also a spatialisation of history, like that, the way that the architecture and the exhibition makes those historical narratives physical as something that one might walk through, as if you might walk through an image. Someone should write that book.
Yeah.
We'll just have one more question because I'm conscious that we do need to get over to QAG for some more talks.
I was fascinated that the Indigenous works that are in the show are far more complex, far more diverse. There's Tracy Moffat, there's little videos, there's the Butler images, there's the bark, there's the weaving, there's the fishnets. It's just a fabulous showcase. The white art is pedestrian. And my other thought was, I've seen 4 images of Christ. There's the Epiphany, Gethsemane, there's the one beneath the little mother and Madonna and child, and there's the baptism, Arthur Boyd's Tyler baptism, and that's fascinating.
That's interesting.
It's small, but they're small, but they're gorgeous.
Yeah.
And they're not squashed like we see so much. So just a thought.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming.